The blare of police sirens shattered the peaceful stillness of Elmwood Heights, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where such disturbances were rare. By his delivery van, a young black man named Marcus Parker stood with his hands raised, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. The officer on the scene barked orders into his radio, requesting backup. "I'm just delivering a package," Marcus pleaded, his voice trembling. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong." Across the street, the homeowner, Mr. Caldwell, stood on his porch, phone clutched tightly in his hand. His finger jabbed accusingly toward Marcus, his tone a blend of fear and indignation. "He doesn't belong here," Caldwell yelled. "He's suspicious. Get him out of here." Unbeknownst to Caldwell, the young man he had so hastily called the police on was none other than the son of Grant Parker, the mayor of Brookstone. Marcus's heart raced, disbelief coursing through him. For months, he had delivered packages in this neighborhood without incident. He prided himself on doing his job well, causing no trouble. But today, everything had changed. The moment Marcus stepped onto Caldwell's porch, he had felt the man's judgmental eyes scanning him, as if his very presence was a violation. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking as the tension grew. Caldwell ignored him, his arms flailing as he continued shouting. The humiliation struck Marcus like a cold gust of wind. He'd been here before, all too familiar with the suspicion and judgment often cast upon him. And now, it was happening again, right in front of his eyes. As the officer advanced toward him, Marcus's phone rang. He glanced down at the caller ID, his breath catching in his throat. It read Mayor Grant Parker. Marcus's hands trembled as he quickly answered. "Marcus, what's going on? Are you okay?" The calm but concerned voice of his father came through the speaker. "Dad, I'm fine, but—" Marcus's voice faltered, frustration lacing his words. "This guy called the cops on me. He thinks I'm up to something just because I'm delivering a package." The mayor's voice turned cold. "Did he say anything specific?" "Yeah," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic bubbling inside. "He said I didn't belong here. He's losing it over nothing." There was a brief pause before his father's voice sharpened. "Stay where you are, son. I'll handle this." Marcus stood frozen, the officer now just steps away. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But then, to his surprise, the officer hesitated. Caldwell, too, seemed to falter, his bravado slipping as he glanced nervously between Marcus and the officer. A long silence fell over the scene, broken only by the faint hum of distant sirens. "This is ridiculous," the officer finally muttered, shaking his head. "We've been getting calls all day about deliveries. You're seriously wasting our time with this?" Caldwell's face turned red, his earlier confidence evaporating. Before Marcus could react, his father's voice came through the officer's radio. "Officer, this is Mayor Grant Parker." His father's voice was calm but commanding. "I suggest you release my son immediately. I'll address this matter in person." The officer's eyes widened in recognition. He looked at Marcus with new understanding, then stepped back, his demeanor shifting. "Of course, sir. No problem," the officer said, his voice uneasy. Meanwhile, Caldwell's face went pale. Realizing whom he had just implicated, his mouth opened and closed in silence, as though searching for the right words but finding none. Marcus stared at Caldwell, his chest tight with anger and a deep, bitter sadness. "Mr. Caldwell," the officer said curtly, turning to the homeowner, "I suggest you think twice before calling the police over something like this. Be more mindful next time." Without another word, the officer returned to his squad car, leaving Caldwell standing on his porch, his shame evident. Marcus felt his pulse pounding in his ears. This was not how he'd imagined his day. The situation had escalated so quickly, and now it was his father's influence that had diffused the chaos. Yet as Marcus turned to leave, the sting of Caldwell's words lingered. "He doesn't belong here." Those words would follow him, a painful reminder of a reality he could never escape. Marcus couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. This wasn't the first time his father's influence had gotten him out of a sticky situation, but it was the first time he had felt so humiliated, so exposed. As he turned and headed back to his van, the homeowner's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "He doesn't belong here." His fists clenched tightly around the van keys, anger bubbling beneath the surface. It was just a delivery, a routine job. Yet somehow it had spiraled into something much bigger, something Marcus couldn't fully grasp. He climbed into the van, shutting the door with more force than necessary. The engine roared to life and he drove off, leaving the tense scene behind. But the silence in the van did little to soothe him. His thoughts raced, pinging around his head like an endless echo. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his haze. A message from his father lit up the screen. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. We need to talk." Marcus sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wasn't sure he was ready for that conversation. But one thing was clear. This day had taken a turn he couldn't ignore. As he wound through the quiet streets of Eastwood Grove, the tension from earlier still hung in the air, as if the neighborhood itself hadn't yet exhaled. The homeowner's accusation replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. The sting of being treated as an outsider lingered, settling heavily in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. Eventually, Marcus pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine. He sat there for a moment, staring at the two-story house in front of him. It was immaculate. Too immaculate. The kind of house that screamed wealth and power, a stark contrast to the scrappy, humble beginnings his father had once known. Marcus felt a pang of unease. He wasn't ungrateful for what his father, Mayor Grant Parker, had built for their family, but it always seemed like he was living in a shadow he hadn't asked for. This house, this neighborhood of pristine lawns and picket fences, didn't feel like home. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Marcus looked up to see his father's black SUV pulling into the driveway. The mayor stepped out, his expression calm yet weighted with concern. His usual air of confidence was there, but Marcus could see the subtle signs of tension in his father's posture and the tightness around his eyes. "Hey, son," Mayor Parker said as he approached, his voice steady but serious. Marcus forced a smile as he opened the van door and stepped out, his legs stiff from sitting so long. "You didn't have to come all the way here," Marcus said, trying to sound casual. "I had to," his father replied, his tone firm but kind. "What happened today was unacceptable. I need to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," Marcus said quickly, though the truth was far more complicated. "It's just one of those things, you know? People like him. They see me and assume the worst. It's not the first time." His father's gaze softened, though his voice dropped to a more serious tone. "Marcus, this isn't something you can just brush off. It's not just about today. It's part of a pattern. And it's something we need to address, both as a family and as a community." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the ground. He didn't want to have this conversation. He didn't want to talk about how people saw him or how his father's status seemed to complicate everything. "Do we really have to do this right now?" Marcus asked, his voice edged with frustration. "Yes," Mayor Parker said firmly, "because this isn't going to stop on its own. Ignoring it won't make it go away. We have to face it." Marcus sighed deeply, leaning against the van. He wanted to believe his father was right, but part of him just wanted to move on, to forget about today. But forgetting wasn't an option, not with the way those words had burrowed into his mind. As his father continued to speak, Marcus knew he wasn't just talking about today's incident. He was talking about everything, the assumptions, the judgment, and the deeper, systemic issues that made moments like this so common. And for the first time, Marcus began to wonder if there was a way to stop it. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, staring at the ground as his father's voice softened. "I heard what he said," Mayor Parker admitted, "and it's not right, but this is the reality we're up against. It's not just about you being my son, it's about how people see us because of the color of our skin." Marcus wanted to argue. He wanted to say that none of this should matter, that his father's name and title shouldn't dictate how he was treated. He wanted to believe he could simply exist without being judged. But deep down, he knew his father was right. Reality didn't care about fairness. "I don't understand, Dad," Marcus said, his frustration rising. "Why does it always have to be this way? Why can't I just deliver packages and go home, like anyone else?" His father placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to understand it, son, but you do need to know that you have power, the power to change things." Marcus shook his head. "I don't know if I can make a difference," he said, his voice heavy. "I just want to live my life without all this drama." Mayor Parker gave him a pointed look. You will make a difference, Marcus, but it's not going to be easy. There are people who don't see you as just a delivery driver. They see you as a threat, or worse, and we can't pretend that's not true. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on Marcus. He felt like he was drowning in them, suffocated by expectations he hadn't asked for. He hadn't chosen to be the mayor's son. He hadn't asked for the responsibilities or the scrutiny that came with the name. Before Marcus could respond, his father's phone buzzed. Mayor Parker glanced at the screen, frowning. I need to take this, he said, stepping away to answer the call. Marcus watched him walk toward the house, his thoughts swirling. He wanted this conversation to end, wanted to push everything about this day as far away as possible. But he knew, deep down, that this wasn't something he could ignore. Not anymore. When his father returned, his face was grim. I have to go, he said. There's something I need to handle downtown. Yeah, okay, Marcus replied, his voice subdued. A lump formed in his throat. He didn't want his father to leave, not now, when the weight of everything felt unbearable. I'll check in with you later, Mayor Parker said, resting his hand on Marcus's shoulder for a moment before turning to head to his car. Marcus nodded, but his heart wasn't in it. He stood there, watching his father's SUV pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. For a long moment, he felt paralyzed, as though he were standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. As he sank onto the porch steps, Marcus stared out at the perfectly trimmed lawn and the quiet street beyond. The events of the morning weighed heavily on him, pressing down with an almost physical force. The words of the homeowner echoed again in his mind. He doesn't belong here. It had been such a simple statement, but its impact was devastating. It had struck at something deep inside him, a wound that wouldn't heal easily. Marcus had been sitting there for over an hour, his mind replaying the confrontation and his father's words, trying to make sense of everything. His father had said Marcus had power, that he could make a difference, but Marcus didn't feel powerful. He felt small, invisible, just another face in a world that refused to see him. The buzz of his phone jolted him from his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing the name on the screen, Noah, his best friend. Yo, how's it going? You need to talk about it? Marcus stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. He didn't want to talk. Not yet. But Noah was the one person he could always rely on, the one who never judged, never tried to fix things, just listened. After a pause, Marcus typed back. Yeah, I don't know what to do anymore. The reply came almost immediately. You should talk to your dad. He's the mayor. He can do something about this. You don't have to go through this alone. Marcus sighed, frustration bubbling up again. He typed back, I don't want to use him to fix everything. It's not about his position. It's about me, just being me. As he sent the message, Marcus leaned back, the weight of the day settling over him once more. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. Life wasn't going back to normal anytime soon. Marcus stared at the message on his phone, Noah's words lingering in his mind. Yeah, but you're his son. If anyone can make a difference, it's him. Noah had a point, but the idea of leaning on his father's influence felt wrong. Marcus didn't want to be seen as the mayor's son. He just wanted to be a person, someone who could walk down the street without being judged, without having to justify his presence. As he mulled over the thought, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Noah. The screen displayed a number Marcus didn't recognize. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the green button. He was still reeling from the day's events, but curiosity won out. Hello? Marcus answered cautiously. Marcus? It's Caldwell, came the voice on the other end. Marcus's stomach turned at the sound of the name. Caldwell, the homeowner who had called the police on him. What do you want? Marcus asked sharply. There was a long pause before Caldwell replied, his voice tentative. I wanted to apologize. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were someone causing trouble in the neighborhood. I was wrong. Marcus's mind raced, emotions colliding within him. Anger, frustration, disbelief. What was this supposed to be? Some kind of redemption? I don't need your apology, Marcus said finally, his voice low but firm. You don't get to just apologize and make everything better. I know, Caldwell replied quickly. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I want to make things right. I don't want to be that guy anymore. Marcus closed his eyes, the frustration rising again. That guy, the one who saw him as a threat, who assumed the worst without knowing anything about him. I don't know if you can make things right, Marcus said after a pause, his voice barely above a whisper. You can't just erase what you did. I know, Caldwell said quietly, but I'm going to try, I promise. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncertain. Part of Marcus wanted to hang up, to walk away from the conversation and everything it represented. But another part of him wasn't so sure. You're right, Marcus said, his voice colder than he intended. I don't need your apology. But I guess it's a start. Just don't do this again. Don't make assumptions about people. I won't, Caldwell said earnestly. I swear, and I'll do whatever I can to make things right. Marcus hung up the phone and stared at it for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. Caldwell's apology lingered, but it didn't feel like enough. Could it ever be enough? Could he ever look at Caldwell without remembering the humiliation and anger of that day? The truth was, Marcus didn't know. He wasn't sure if he could forgive or move past it. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this go. Not yet. Not while so much still needed to be done. He stood and walked toward the house, his mind heavy with questions. The conversation with Caldwell had only opened more uncertainty, not the clarity Marcus had hoped for. But maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. As he stepped inside, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. Marcus opened it, his stomach dropping as he read the subject line. Urgent. Mayor's office, press conference tomorrow. Marcus's heart raced. This was it. His father was going to address what had happened. The email outlined the details of the conference, including instructions for Marcus to attend. He stared at the screen, his mind spinning. The idea of being thrust into the spotlight made his chest tighten. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of the media's attention. But now, it seemed inevitable. Closing his eyes, Marcus took a deep breath. There was no turning back. His father was already moving forward, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before the world found out what had really happened that day. The next morning, the city was alive with energy. The sun shone brightly, people bustled through the streets, and the familiar hum of the city felt louder than ever. But to Marcus, everything seemed heavier. The air itself felt thick, filled with tension, as if the city was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. As he prepared for the press conference, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the day would mark a turning point. Not just for him, but for something much bigger. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. The noise from the early morning seemed to echo endlessly in Marcus's mind. He hadn't slept well the night before. The press conference loomed over him, its significance weighing heavily on his thoughts. Marcus knew that stepping into that room would change everything. His father, Mayor Grant Parker, had already explained the stakes. The media would be there. The city would be watching. That knowledge had kept Marcus awake, his thoughts spiraling through every possible outcome. Today was the day the mayor would address the confrontation between Marcus and the homeowner, Caldwell. The incident had sparked a wildfire of controversy across the city. Headlines blared across screens and social media. Black delivery driver harassed by white homeowner, sparks call for justice. As Marcus wandered the halls of his father's house, he felt the shift in the air. The usual calm of the mornings here was gone. Staff members hurried about, whispering, texting, and preparing for the media frenzy. The house felt more like a command center than a home. Marcus wanted nothing more than to disappear, to fade into the background. He wasn't looking to become a symbol or a headline, but escaping this wasn't an option anymore. Marcus, his father's voice cut through his thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Marcus turned to see Mayor Parker standing at the door of the living room. His father looked as composed as ever, dressed sharply, his posture commanding, but Marcus could see beyond the polished exterior. The mayor looked tired, older even, like the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. "Ready for the press conference?" his father asked, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable undertone of strain. Marcus hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Was he ready? Could he stand in front of cameras and share his truth, knowing the world would judge every word, every expression? "I guess," Marcus said quietly, his voice betraying his uncertainty. His father stepped closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," he said. But it's important. You've been through something, and it's time to speak your truth. Marcus swallowed hard. I don't want to be the story, he admitted. I just want to move on. I know, his father replied, his voice gentle but firm. But sometimes moving on means facing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. This isn't just about you, Marcus. This is about something bigger. We have an opportunity to start a conversation that needs to happen. Marcus nodded, reluctantly, though he still didn't feel ready for the conversation his father spoke of. He wanted to go back to his job, his routine, the simplicity of his life before all of this. But as they left the house and climbed into the mayor's SUV, he couldn't ignore the gravity of what lay ahead. The ride to City Hall was quiet, the air inside the car thick with unspoken words. Marcus stared out the window, watching the city blur past. His mind wasn't on the streets or the buildings. It was on the moment waiting for him at the end of the drive. When they arrived at City Hall, the scene outside was overwhelming. A swarm of reporters and photographers had already gathered, their cameras and microphones at the ready. The buzz of voices and the flashes of cameras made Marcus feel exposed, as if every eye was on him, scrutinizing his every move. His father stepped out of the car first, his stride confident, as if the chaos around him didn't exist. But Marcus, watching closely, noticed the tightness in his father's shoulders and the way he glanced back to make sure Marcus was following. Come on, Marcus, Mayor Parker said, extending his hand. We've got this. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, willing himself to ignore the reporters' stares and shouts. He followed his father into the large auditorium where the press conference was being held. Inside, the sea of reporters and cameras was even more intimidating. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as they made their way to the stage. At the center was a podium, waiting like a spotlight. His father approached the microphone, adjusting it as he turned to face the crowd. Marcus stood beside him, unsure of where to place himself, unsure of what to do. He felt completely out of place, like a fish thrown into open air. Thank you all for coming today, Mayor Parker began, his voice steady and commanding. We're here to discuss an incident that took place in our city, a troubling incident that raises important questions about race, assumptions, and how we treat one another. Marcus glanced around the room, his eyes catching the reporters as they leaned in, their pens poised, their cameras trained on the mayor. He could feel the weight of their expectations, the hunger for a soundbite that would define the story. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something far bigger. But even as his father continued to speak, Marcus couldn't shake the knot of uncertainty tightening in his chest. Marcus didn't know what to expect as his father continued speaking from the podium. Was Mayor Parker going to confront Caldwell's actions directly, or would he try to smooth things over, avoiding conflict like so many politicians before him? As many of you know, Mayor Parker began, his voice steady and commanding, my son, Marcus Parker, was the victim of an unfortunate situation just a few days ago, a situation in which he was harassed, wrongly accused, and made to feel like he didn't belong in his own community. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Marcus, who stood to the side, feeling the weight of their stares. Marcus, his father said, turning to him, would you like to say a few words? Marcus froze. The last thing he wanted was to stand in front of the world and bare his soul, but his father's eyes urged him forward. Taking a deep breath, Marcus stepped up to the microphone. Every part of him felt tense, as though he was walking a tightrope above a pit of judgment. I don't know what to say, Marcus began, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced around the room, seeing the expectant faces of reporters, cameras trained on him, capturing his every movement. I didn't ask for this, he continued, his voice wavering. I didn't ask to be treated like I don't belong. I was just doing my job, trying to make a living. But this isn't just about me. It's about how people see me. It's about how people see us, how we're judged before we even have a chance to show who we are. He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but somewhere within, he found the strength to keep going. And I don't know if an apology is enough, Marcus said, his voice growing steadier. I don't know if anything can make this right, but what I do know is that this needs to stop. We can't keep living in a world where people are treated differently because of their skin color. It's not fair. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Marcus's heart raced, but as he looked out over the crowd, he felt something shift within him. This was it, the moment he had dreaded, but also the moment where his voice was finally heard. "Thank you, Marcus," his father said, stepping forward and placing a hand on his shoulder. "I couldn't be more proud of you." The reporters seemed to hold their breath for a moment before the questions began. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, but Marcus barely noticed. He had said what he needed to say, and the rest felt like noise. As the press conference wound down and the reporters began to disperse, Marcus felt the weight of it all hit him. He had spoken his truth, but now what? Would it change anything? Could it? Back in the quiet of his father's office, Marcus replayed the moments in his mind. Every word he'd said, every second of discomfort, felt heavier now than it had in the moment. The office itself was pristine, a sharp contrast to the chaos swirling inside him. The polished mahogany desk, the sleek furniture, the awards lining the walls, they all screamed power and authority. It was a world his father had mastered, but to Marcus, it still felt distant, like a space he didn't belong in. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Noah. "Yo bro, you good? Saw the press conference. You nailed it." Marcus stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Did he? Had he really nailed it? The words didn't feel like they belonged to him anymore. They had spilled out before he could think them through, and now they were out in the world for everyone to dissect. "I don't know, man. It's all a blur," Marcus typed back. Before Noah could reply, the door opened. Mayor Parker walked in, his face calm but filled with a quiet pride. "Marcus," his father said, sitting across from him, "you did a great job today. You spoke your truth, and that's all anyone can ask of you." "I don't know if it felt like that," Marcus admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It just felt like I was thrown into it, like I didn't have a choice." "You did have a choice," his father said firmly. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You chose to stand up and be heard, and that's something most people never do." Marcus glanced out of the window, the setting sun casting a warm glow over the city. He wasn't sure if his father was right. Had he really chosen to speak out, or had he been pushed into it by circumstance? Either way, the words were out there now, and there was no taking them back. The world was watching, and Marcus didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, he felt like his voice mattered. Whether he liked it or not, he had become part of something bigger. The setting sun cast an orange glow across Westbridge, bathing the city in a warm, fleeting light. Marcus sat quietly in his father's office, staring out of the window. His father's words had truth to them, but they couldn't ease the knot of discomfort in his chest. "I just don't know if it will make any difference," Marcus said softly. "Even if I speak out, nothing really changes. People still look at me like I don't belong." Mayor Parker studied his son for a moment, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "The fact that you're speaking out is the first step toward change. It's not going to happen overnight, Marcus, but your voice is part of the movement. Every time we speak out, we chip away at the walls that divide us." Marcus leaned back in his chair with a weary sigh. "But what if they never listen? What if nothing changes?" His father's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Change doesn't come from instant results, son. It's a slow process, one that starts with people like you. People who have the courage to say, enough is enough." There was a pause as Mayor Parker stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that stretched before him. "I know this is hard. I know it's not the life you imagined. But this is the reality we face, and sometimes the only way forward is to confront it head-on." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't know how to make sense of everything swirling around him. His father was right in many ways, but Marcus didn't want his life to be defined by this battle. He wanted things to go back to the way they were, to normal. "I just want things to go back to normal," Marcus muttered, almost to himself. His father turned to him, his expression filled with a rare tenderness. "I know you do, but things have changed, Marcus, whether you want them to or not." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Before either of them could respond, a young woman stepped inside. It was Sadie, one of the mayor's senior aides. Her face was serious, her posture brisk. "Mayor Parker," Sadie said, glancing at Marcus before returning her focus to his father. We've received a lot of media attention. The story is spreading faster than we anticipated. There's already talk of protests, and some local groups are organizing rallies in support of Marcus. It's gaining momentum. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Protests? He wasn't ready for that. He had barely begun to process what had happened, and now it was growing into something much bigger than him. What do you mean, protests? Mayor Parker asked, his voice tinged with concern. Sadie shifted slightly, her expression steady but cautious. It's the usual mix. Some groups are calling for justice and demanding change. Others are organizing marches to raise awareness about racial injustice. But she hesitated. But what? Marcus pressed, his voice tighter than he intended. Sadie's face grew more serious. Not everyone is supportive. There's backlash too. People who don't like the attention this is bringing or the idea of a story like this gaining traction. Marcus's heart raced. It was all moving so fast. The pressure of it all was starting to feel unbearable. I didn't ask for any of this, he muttered, his voice strained. Sadie looked at him sympathetically. I know, she said softly. No one expected this to escalate like it has. But your story has hit a nerve. People are paying attention. Mayor Parker turned back to Marcus, his gaze steady. We'll handle this, son. We'll make sure you're safe, and we'll make sure your voice is heard. But you need to be prepared. This is just the beginning. Marcus nodded, though uncertainty weighed heavily on him. He wasn't ready for protests, for rallies, for media scrutiny. He wasn't ready to be a symbol of change. Can I just take a minute? Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. I need some space to think. His father nodded, his expression softening. Of course, take all the time you need. Sadie and the mayor left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He sank further into the chair, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. The protests weren't just headlines anymore. They were becoming a reality he couldn't escape. The fight for justice, for change, it was becoming his fight too. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. What had he gotten himself into? The world seemed to be bearing down on him, and he didn't know if he had the strength to carry it all. But as the last rays of sunlight faded and the city outside grew quiet, one thing became clear. The world was watching, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a whirlwind. News outlets, social media, and local activists were abuzz with the aftermath of the press conference. Marcus barely had time to process one message before another came his way. The weight of the situation grew heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the press. The protests were taking shape. Rallies were being planned. Tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface were now boiling over, and Marcus felt caught in the middle. His phone was a constant source of anxiety. Messages flooded in, some offering support, others laced with anger or outright hostility. Marcus couldn't escape the feeling that his life was no longer his own. He wasn't just Marcus Parker anymore. He had become a symbol, whether he liked it or not. And as the tension in the city mounted, he began to wonder if he was ready for what lay ahead. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. Everywhere he went, it was the same, eyes following him. Some gazes were sympathetic, filled with quiet encouragement. Others, however, were harsh and judgmental, as though he'd done something wrong by speaking out. The attention was overwhelming. Praises and criticisms poured in, blurring together into a chaotic hum. Marcus couldn't tell who was truly on his side and who wasn't. More than anything, it was the way people looked at him that stung the most. He felt like he'd been stripped of his anonymity. Every time he stepped outside, it was as though the whole world was staring, waiting for him to say or do something that might confirm whatever narrative they believed about him. Marcus found himself spending more time in his father's office, where the polished walls and steady hum of activity offered a strange sense of stability. Mayor Parker insisted he stay out of the public eye for now, but it hardly mattered. The media had already latched onto his story, turning him into something far bigger than he felt capable of being. Late one evening, as Marcus sat alone in his father's office, his phone vibrated with a new message. The sender was anonymous, and there was no subject line or signature. Just one chilling sentence. You don't belong here. Stay out of this city. Marcus stared at the words, his stomach dropping. His mind raced, trying to figure out if it was just a cruel prank or something far more sinister. But as the chill spread through him, it became clear that the intent behind the message didn't matter. The threat was unmistakable. For the first time in days, Marcus felt real fear. The protests, the media frenzy, the relentless scrutiny. It was all too much. And now this. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm the storm raging in his mind. He couldn't let this message control him, couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had come too far for that. Just as he began to steady himself, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Sadie, his father's assistant. "There's a meeting tomorrow with some local community leaders. Your father wants you to attend. It's time to discuss the next steps." Marcus read the message, his stomach twisting in knots. Another meeting. More discussions. More people with opinions about his life, his actions, his story. It wasn't about the delivery anymore. It was about something much larger. His identity, his place in the city, and how far he was willing to go to fight for justice. Marcus typed back a quick response. "I'll be there." But even as he sent the message, doubts lingered. What was he committing to? Would speaking out really make a difference, or would it only paint a bigger target on his back? The night passed in restless fits of sleep, his mind tangled with worry. By morning, Marcus was already exhausted, but there was no backing out now. His father had made it clear this was the next step. As he got dressed, Marcus tried to push his fears aside. He couldn't afford to falter, not with so many people watching, waiting to see what he would do next. When Marcus arrived at the meeting, he was greeted by a small group of community leaders, activists, and concerned citizens. His father sat at the head of the table, speaking quietly with a few others. The room was thick with tension. Some faces were kind, offering subtle nods of encouragement. Others were more skeptical, their expressions guarded. "Marcus," his father said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I'm glad you could join us." Marcus nodded, sliding into a chair next to his father. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, and it made his chest tighten. Mayor Parker surveyed the room, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to discuss the next steps. The protests, the rallies. It's clear that something needs to change. We need to figure out how we move forward, together." A middle-aged woman named Helena, a prominent community activist, spoke up. "This conversation needs to start with accountability," she said. "We can't let incidents like what happened to Marcus go unchecked. People like Caldwell need to be held responsible for their actions. Justice has to mean something." Marcus nodded silently, though his mind was spinning. He didn't know where he fit into all of this. He had already spoken out, already shared his story. But now, sitting in this room, surrounded by people who had been fighting for justice for years, he felt out of his depth. The room buzzed with voices as the group debated strategies, shared ideas, and clashed over priorities. Marcus listened quietly, absorbing it all. He wasn't sure what the next steps were, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just about him anymore. The meeting ended after hours of intense discussion, leaving Marcus more drained than ever. As he walked out of the room, his father caught up to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did well," Mayor Parker said. Marcus didn't feel like he'd done anything. But as he looked around at the people leaving the meeting, he realized that the path forward wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up, about staying in the fight, even when it felt overwhelming. And for the first time he began to understand what his father had meant when he said this was only the beginning. As Marcus sat among the group of community leaders and activists, he felt an overwhelming sense of inadequacy. These were people who had been fighting this battle for years, people who understood the depth of the issue in ways Marcus was only beginning to grasp. Helena, the activist who had spoken earlier, turned to him, her gaze steady and direct. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you've started something. But this isn't over. This is about more than one incident. It's about systemic change. It's about making sure that people like you, people who are seen as outsiders, don't have to go through this again." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He hadn't thought much beyond his own experience. He hadn't realized just how deep the roots of the problem ran. It wasn't just about him delivering a package. It wasn't even just about Caldwell's actions. It was about an entire system that viewed people like him as less than, as outsiders. His father's voice broke through his thoughts, steady and authoritative. Marcus and I have been discussing how we can move forward. This has to be more than just words. We need tangible change. We need to examine the policies in this city, the systems that affect people of color, and work toward creating something better for everyone. The discussion around the table continued, but Marcus found it difficult to focus. His mind was racing, grappling with the weight of what was being said. This wasn't just about speaking out anymore. It was a call to action, a demand for something greater. When the meeting finally ended, Marcus felt both overwhelmed and strangely determined. He didn't know exactly what steps to take next or how he could make a difference, but he understood one thing. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a movement. Walking out of the room with his father beside him, Marcus felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. But alongside the pressure, there was something new, something small but undeniable. A spark, a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, he felt like he might be able to face what was coming. As they left the building, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his breath catching when he read the message. "We're watching you. You won't get away with this." A chill ran down his spine. It was another anonymous threat, a reminder that no matter how far he tried to run from the past, the shadow of prejudice and injustice was always lurking. But this time, Marcus didn't let fear take hold. He wasn't going to run. He couldn't. As he stepped into the car, the resolve he had felt earlier solidified. Whatever was coming, he was ready to face it. The days after the meeting were more intense than Marcus could have imagined. His life, already turned upside down, seemed to enter uncharted territory. Every decision, every move he made, was scrutinized. His voice had been amplified, and there was no turning back now. The protests, which had started as small gatherings, grew rapidly. What had once been a local story was now gaining national attention. Social media was ablaze with Marcus's story. Activists, influencers, and everyday people were rallying around him, drawn to the cause of justice. It was becoming a movement, and Marcus was at the center of it. The support was overwhelming at times, but it wasn't all positive. Alongside the messages of encouragement came hostility. The anonymous threats didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and more menacing. Marcus tried not to let it get to him, but it was hard. He couldn't help but feel the pressure building, the weight of expectations pressing down on him. "Marcus?" His father's voice interrupted his thoughts as they sat in the mayor's office. The desk between them was cluttered with papers, press briefings, protest updates, and plans for the next steps. "We've got another press briefing this afternoon," Mayor Parker said. "I need you to be prepared for more questions, especially about the protests." Marcus nodded, though his mind wasn't fully on the briefing. "I'm tired of talking," he admitted, his voice low but tinged with frustration. "I don't think it's helping. People are still angry. Nothing is changing." His father sighed, looking at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. "I know it feels that way," he said, "but your voice matters, Marcus. These protests, they're a sign that people are listening, and that's a step forward." Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't feel like we're moving forward," he muttered. "It's like we're stuck in the same cycle, the same headlines, the same anger. When does it end?" "Change takes time," his father replied, leaning forward, his voice steady. "Sometimes it feels like we're not getting anywhere, but we're laying the groundwork for something bigger. Every time you speak, every time people come together, it chips away at the walls that divide us." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He looked out of the window, the city sprawling before him. It was hard to believe that his story had grown into something so much larger than himself. For the first time, though, he began to understand that the change his father spoke of wasn't something he could see in a single moment. It was a process, slow and painful, but necessary, and whether he liked it or not, Marcus was part of it now. Marcus felt a deep weariness settle over him as his father, Mayor Grant Parker, tried to reassure him. "Marcus, we've made an impact already," his father said, his tone steady but insistent. "Your story has inspired people to stand up and demand justice. That's something." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wanted to believe his father, but doubt clung to him like a shadow. He hadn't chosen to be the center of this story, and he was exhausted. All he wanted was to go back to his life before that day when everything had spiraled out of control. But he knew there was no going back. Not anymore. As the press briefing approached, Marcus tried to prepare himself. But focusing was nearly impossible. The anxiety from the anonymous threats continued to haunt him. The feeling of being watched, of never being truly safe, followed him everywhere. He constantly looked over his shoulder, wondering who might be sending those messages, or worse, who might be waiting for him out there. The briefing itself went as expected. Reporters peppered his father with questions about the protests, the investigation into Caldwell, and the city's stance on racial inequality. Mayor Parker remained composed, answering every question with practiced ease. But Marcus knew, deep down, that no words would be enough. The wounds were too deep for statements to heal them. After the briefing, Marcus wandered through the halls of Westwood City Hall. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm, and finding peace felt impossible. People looked to him for answers, for leadership. But Marcus didn't know how to lead. He was just a man, a delivery driver, who had been thrust into something far bigger than himself. "Marcus," a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Sadie walking toward him, her expression serious. "Your dad's looking for you," she said. "There's something you need to see." Marcus followed her down the corridor, unease prickling at the back of his neck. She led him into a small office where his father stood, staring at a large screen. "We've just received these," Mayor Parker said, pointing to the display. "They were sent by a source in the city. We believe they're connected to the threats you've been receiving." Marcus stepped closer, his heart pounding. On the screen were a series of photos, shots of his home, his father's office, and even places Marcus frequently visited. There were pictures of him leaving City Hall, captured from angles that felt too precise, too invasive. The feeling of being watched was no longer just paranoia. It was real. Marcus's stomach twisted. Who would do this? "We don't know yet," his father replied, his voice tight with anger. "But this is meant to send a message. Someone is trying to intimidate you. This isn't just about the protests anymore. Whoever's behind this is escalating." Marcus stood frozen, staring at the images. His mind raced as the reality of the situation sank in. He had received threats before, but this was different. Someone had been tracking him, watching his every move. Sadie stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to take this seriously, Marcus. This isn't just about your safety anymore. It's about your family too. We have to increase security around your home, your father's office, everywhere." Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice trembling. I just wanted to do my job. Why is this happening?" Mayor Parker placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "I know this is hard, Marcus, but you're not alone in this. We're going to protect you, and we're going to find out who's behind this." The next few days were a blur. Meetings, phone calls, and security upgrades consumed every waking moment. Marcus was now constantly surrounded by bodyguards, and private security teams monitored every aspect of his life. The media attention didn't let up either. Everywhere he turned, cameras and reporters seemed to follow. His life had become a whirlwind of chaos and uncertainty, and no matter where he went, Marcus felt trapped. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus received a call from an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice shaky. "Marcus," a distorted voice replied. "We know who you are. We know what you've been doing, and it's time you stopped." Marcus's blood ran cold. It was the same voice from the anonymous threats. "We're not going to let you get away with this," the voice continued, low and menacing. "You'll regret ever stepping out of line." The line went dead before Marcus could respond. He stood frozen in his living room, the phone still pressed to his ear, his mind spinning. The threats had always felt distant before, just words on a screen. But now they felt real, too real. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching. They were waiting. Marcus knew deep down that the worst was yet to come. Marcus's once mundane and predictable life had become something straight out of a suspense novel. Every step he took, every call he answered, every interaction he had, it all felt shadowed by an ever-present threat. The city of Westwood had become a stage, and Marcus was both the performer and the target. The cryptic threats and the distorted voice from the phone call left Marcus shaken, though his father's response was immediate. Security was ramped up around his home and the mayor's office. Experts were brought in to trace the source of the threats, but even with these precautions, the sense of looming danger clung to Marcus like a dark cloud. He couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every time he left the house, the security detail followed closely, their presence a constant reminder that he was no longer just Marcus, the delivery driver. He was a symbol and a target. Though the media had started to shift its focus, the protests continued to swell. The anger and division remained palpable, festering just beneath the surface. Marcus could see the toll it was taking on his father. Mayor Grant Parker maintained his calm, authoritative demeanor in front of the cameras, speaking about unity and change. But at home, Marcus could sense the strain. His father was carrying the weight of the city's expectations, the demands of his position, and the need to protect his son. That evening, after a long day of meetings and security updates, Marcus sat alone in his father's office. What had once been a sanctuary now felt suffocating. The walls lined with awards and achievements were a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing outside. His phone buzzed again, jolting him from his thoughts. Another message appeared. "We're watching you. Keep pushing, and we'll make sure it's your last mistake." It was the same anonymous number, the same distorted voice that had haunted him for days. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Fear and anger churned within him. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the grip of shadows and threats. But he also knew he couldn't walk away, not with so much at stake. The protests weren't just about him anymore. They were for everyone who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or made to feel like they didn't belong. Marcus's story had grown into something much larger than himself, a rallying cry for justice. His phone buzzed again, snapping him back to reality. This time, it was his father. "Marcus, are you still at the office?" Mayor Parker's voice was tight with urgency. "Yeah," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just here going through some stuff." "You need to get out of there now," his father said sharply. "There's been a security breach at the building. We've just been notified and it's not safe." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, not safe? What's going on?" "We don't have all the details yet," his father said, his tone more serious than Marcus had ever heard it. "But we have reason to believe someone's infiltrated the building. The threats, they've escalated. You need to leave now." Marcus's mind raced as he stood from his chair, his legs unsteady. Panic surged through him, but instinct took over. He grabbed his jacket and hurried to the door, his breaths coming faster with each step. As he made his way down the hallway, the sound of hurried footsteps behind him made him freeze. He turned, expecting to see one of the security team. Instead, he saw a man in a black hoodie, his face obscured by a mask. The man moved toward him quickly, his steps calculated and precise. Marcus's pulse raced as his mind struggled to process what was happening. Was this the person who had been sending the threats? Was it someone trying to silence him? Before he could react, the man lunged, grabbing Marcus's arm and pulling him into a nearby storage room. The door slammed shut behind them, locking the two of them inside. Marcus fought back, adrenaline surging through his veins. He tried to yell for help, but the man's grip was strong, his movements deliberate. Marcus was shoved to the ground, the breath knocked out of him. The man's labored breaths filled the small room as he loomed over Marcus. Through the narrow slits of the mask, Marcus could see the hatred burning in the stranger's eyes. This wasn't random. This was personal. Whoever this was, they wanted Marcus silenced. "You should have stayed quiet," the man growled, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed in your place, but you didn't, and now you're going to regret it." Marcus struggled against the man's weight, his mind racing. He couldn't let this be the end. "You think you can shut me up?" Marcus spat, his voice defiant despite his fear. "You think you can scare me into giving up? I'm not stopping." The man's eyes narrowed with fury, and he pressed harder, pinning Marcus down. "You think you're some kind of hero?" the man sneered. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Summoning every ounce of strength, Marcus pushed against the man, throwing him off balance for just a moment. It was enough time for Marcus to scramble to his feet. He darted for the door, slamming his shoulder against it in desperation. But it wouldn't budge. It was locked. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he looked around the room, searching for another way out. And then, through the thin walls, he heard it. Footsteps and shouting from the hallway. Help was coming. The man hesitated for a moment, the noise clearly unsettling him. Marcus seized the opportunity, grabbing a metal shelf and shoving it toward his attacker. The man stumbled, and Marcus bolted for the small window on the far wall. It was narrow, but it was his only chance. With trembling hands, Marcus pushed the window open and climbed onto the fire escape outside. He didn't stop to look back. He didn't wait to see if the man was following. All he could do was run. The city streets blurred around him as he sprinted down the alley. His heart pounded, his legs burned, but he didn't stop. Somewhere behind him, he thought he heard the man's voice shouting, but he didn't dare slow down to confirm it. By the time Marcus reached a crowded street, his lungs were screaming for air. He ducked into a corner and crouched down, trying to steady his racing heart. The world around him felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Whoever was behind this wasn't just sending threats anymore. They were acting on them. And Marcus knew this was far from over. Marcus felt the man's weight pressing down on him, suffocating his attempts to fight back. The stranger's voice was a growl, low and threatening. "You should have stayed quiet," the man hissed. "You should have stayed in your lane. You don't belong in this fight, and now you're going to regret it." Marcus's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His mind raced as he struggled beneath the man's grip. He needed to think, to act, but fear blurred everything around him. "You don't get to decide what happens next," Marcus spat, his voice sharp and defiant despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I'll speak out as long as I need to. You can't stop me." The man's eyes flared with rage. "You think you're a hero? Some symbol of change? You're nothing. Just a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Summoning every ounce of strength, Marcus shoved against the man, throwing him off balance just long enough to scramble to his feet. He lunged toward the door, slamming his shoulder against it in desperation. But it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. He was trapped. Then came a sudden burst of noise, footsteps and shouting echoing from the hallway. The man froze, distracted for a split second, and Marcus seized the opportunity. He darted toward the small window on the far side of the room. He didn't know if anyone outside could hear him, but he had no choice. Pushing the window open with trembling hands, he climbed onto the fire escape. His heart pounded as he descended the metal stairs, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. "This isn't over," the man shouted after him, his voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus didn't look back. He couldn't. The city streets were a blur as Marcus ran, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The adrenaline that had fueled him moments earlier was fading, leaving behind a wave of exhaustion and fear. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a small group of people. Their faces were unfamiliar, but something in their expressions gave him pause. A woman with tired eyes met his gaze, her face lined with the weight of the past few weeks. She gave him a subtle nod, a wordless acknowledgement that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Did she know who he was? Did she understand what he just escaped? Or was it the look on his face, a mix of terror and resolve, that spoke for him? Marcus shook off the thought and kept moving, ducking into a side street. The narrow alleys twisted around him like a maze, but he didn't stop until the pounding in his chest slowed and the sounds of pursuit faded. His breath came in ragged bursts, his legs trembling beneath him. The physical chase might have ended, but the psychological weight lingered. Someone out there wanted him silenced, and they wouldn't stop until they succeeded. As Marcus reached another block, his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket, startling him. His hands shook as he pulled it out, dread pooling in his stomach. The message was from an unknown number, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You can't hide forever. The price for your silence is coming. The next step won't be as easy." Marcus's stomach churned. He had barely escaped the building, barely outrun the danger, and now this. The message felt like a taunt, a reminder that whoever was behind the threats wasn't going to stop. The world around Marcus blurred as he stood there, the weight of it all crashing down on him. He was exhausted, terrified and unsure of how much more he could endure. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The fight was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. Marcus's fingers trembled as he typed out the question. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The reply came almost instantly, as if the sender had been waiting. "You'll find out soon enough. You think your father can protect you? You're wrong." The cryptic message left Marcus frozen, his heart pounding as he stared at the screen. He didn't know who was behind the threats, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to stop. The worst part wasn't just the fear, it was the uncertainty. What did they want? To silence him? To crush the movement that had taken root? He couldn't answer these questions, but one thing was certain: he couldn't face this alone anymore. This wasn't just about the protests, the press, or even the politics of Riverton. This was something deeper, something that had the power to tear everything apart. Taking a deep breath, Marcus steadied himself. He had to confront this head-on. It was time to go back to his father's office and get to the bottom of it all. The walk to the mayor's office was tense, every step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Marcus's mind spun as he pieced together the events of the past weeks. This wasn't just about one mistake or one hateful person. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the scale of the problem. These threats weren't personal. They were part of something much bigger. When he arrived at City Hall, security was tighter than ever. The guard at the front desk nodded as Marcus entered, his silent acknowledgement a reminder of how much things had changed. Inside the office, his father, Mayor Grant Parker, and his assistant, Dana, were deep in conversation. Their voices stopped the moment Marcus stepped in. Both turned to him, their faces a mix of concern and surprise. "Marcus," his father said, standing from behind his desk. "You're here. Is everything okay?" Marcus swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. "I don't know, Dad. I really don't. Someone tried to." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Finally, he admitted, "Someone tried to hurt me. I barely got away." The mayor's face hardened immediately. "What happened?" he asked, his tone sharp with concern. "I was in the office, going over some things," Marcus began. "Then someone attacked me. I managed to escape, but it's not just that. There are photos of me, of my movements. They're tracking me, Dad. I'm not safe, and I don't think this is just about me anymore." Dana stepped forward, her expression serious. "Mayor Parker, this is escalating. We can't ignore it anymore. We need to take stronger action before things get worse." The mayor nodded, his voice low and tense. "Marcus, you'll stay with me from now on. We're increasing security around you, and I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I promise you. I won't let anyone hurt you." Marcus shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not just me they're after, Dad. Whoever's behind this, they don't just want me to shut up. They want to silence everything we're standing for. The protests, the movement, the change we're trying to create, they want it all to stop." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. His father's face was unreadable, his expression tight with thought. Finally he spoke, his tone steady but filled with determination. "Then we fight back," he said. "But we do it smart. We find out who's behind this, and we bring them to light. For now, Marcus, you're not going anywhere alone, not until we know you're safe." Marcus nodded, the weight of his father's words settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing tall and facing whatever was coming. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A staff member entered, her face pale and serious. "Sir," she said, addressing Mayor Parker, "we've received more information. This isn't an isolated case. There are other incidents, other threats, and it's all connected to the same group." Marcus's blood ran cold. The mayor's expression darkened as he processed the news. "What kind of group are we dealing with?" he asked quietly. "We don't know the full extent yet," the staffer replied, "but it's organized. They've been working in the shadows for a long time, and this isn't the first time they've targeted someone trying to make a change." Marcus stared at the floor, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Whoever was behind this wasn't acting alone. This was bigger than he had imagined, much bigger. His father spoke again, his voice calm but resolute. "We're dealing with something much darker than we thought," he said. "But we'll figure it out. We'll protect you, Marcus." Marcus looked up, meeting his father's eyes. There was no doubt about the danger they faced, but there was also no turning back. Taking a deep breath, Marcus nodded. "I'm not running, Dad. Not anymore." As Marcus left the office later that evening, the weight of the day bore down on him. Everything he had known, his simple routines, his life as it was before, had been swept away. Now he was caught in a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty, a constant cycle of threats and danger. But deep down, he knew one thing. This fight was personal now, and Marcus wasn't going to back down. That night, as Marcus sat in his father's office with Dana and Mayor Parker, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on them all. The once polished room, with its grand furniture and framed accolades, now felt more like a fortress under siege. "Marcus," his father began, his tone steady but tense, "we've gone through everything we know about these threats. There's something much bigger at play here. This isn't just random violence, it's organized." Marcus leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean, organized? Who's behind this? Who are we even up against?" Dana interjected, her voice sharp with urgency. "We're still piecing it together, but every attack, every threat, every lead points to one thing: a group that's desperate to maintain the status quo. They're scared, Marcus, scared of the change you represent. They want to keep things exactly as they are." A chill ran down Marcus's spine. The protests, the media coverage, the collective demand for justice, it wasn't just stirring public opinion. It was making the wrong people nervous, people with enough power to orchestrate something this sinister. "We're not just dealing with local resistance," Mayor Parker added, his voice grim. "This group has influence far beyond Riverton. They're tied to powerful interests who don't want the narrative to shift, and they'll do whatever it takes to shut you down before this movement gains more traction." Marcus swallowed hard. "But why me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why is it so important to keep me quiet?" "Because you're the face of this change," his father replied, locking eyes with him. "You've inspired people to speak out, to demand justice, and that makes you a target. You can't back down now. You have a voice, Marcus, and it matters more than ever." The pressure pressed down on Marcus's chest like a weight he couldn't escape. His father was right. He had become more than a delivery driver. He had become a symbol of defiance, of everything those in power feared. But the lingering question remained. How could he fight back against such an elusive, shadowy enemy? How could he stand up to an organization capable of reaching into the highest levels of influence? Before Marcus could voice his doubts, the door to the office opened. A staff member entered, her face pale with urgency. "Sir," she said, addressing the mayor, "we've just received some new information. It's from a confidential source. There's not much, but it might help." She handed a file to Mayor Parker, who opened it immediately. His expression hardened as he scanned the pages. "This is it," he muttered under his breath. "We've got a lead." Marcus sat up straight, his pulse quickening. "Who is it? Do we know who's behind this?" The mayor's voice was low but resolute. "A whistleblower. Someone from inside the group. They've had enough of what's been happening and decided to come forward. They've given us names, locations, and even plans. If this checks out, we might finally have a chance to dismantle the entire operation." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. If the information was real, if they could expose and take down the people behind the threats, maybe there was a way out of this nightmare. But as the thought crossed his mind, doubt crept in. The whistleblower had risked everything to share this information. The people they were up against wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their operation. "Is it safe?" Dana asked, her voice tight. "Do we even know who we can trust? If they've been operating under the radar for this long, there's no telling how far their reach extends, or who might be on their side." Mayor Parker nodded grimly. "We'll move carefully. Take every precaution. We can't afford to act recklessly, but this is our opportunity." Marcus felt his hands grow clammy, his mind racing. The idea of confronting this group scared him more than he cared to admit. The stakes weren't just personal anymore. They were about everyone who had ever been wronged, silenced, or made to feel like they didn't belong. "Are we really doing this?" Marcus asked quietly. "Are we going to expose them?" "We are," his father said firmly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You've already done the hard part, Marcus. You've raised awareness. Now it's time to take action." Marcus looked around the room at the people who had stood by him, their determination unwavering. The fear gnawed at him, but so did the spark of purpose. He nodded. "Let's do it." And despite the fear that clung to Marcus, a strange resolve began to solidify within him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight for a better future, for a world where no one would be silenced or overlooked because of their identity. He owed it to the people who stood by him, to those who had endured injustice in silence for far too long. "Let's do it," Marcus said, his voice steady, even as unease churned in his chest. The days that followed were a whirlwind of planning, strategizing, and tense anticipation. Mayor Parker's office, along with the security team, worked tirelessly to verify every detail from the whistleblower's revelations. The names, the locations, the plans, it all checked out. But with every step closer to exposing the group, the risks mounted. One wrong move could unravel everything. Marcus was given clear instructions: lay low, stay out of the public eye, and trust the team to handle the operation. But as the days stretched on, he felt the restlessness growing inside him. Sitting on the sidelines didn't sit well with him. One evening, as the sky outside the window darkened into twilight, his father called him into the study. Mayor Parker's face was drawn, the weight of their mission reflected in the creases around his eyes. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," his father began, his voice heavy. "We're about to take an enormous risk. Exposing this group isn't just about pulling the curtain back on corruption. It's about dismantling an entire system, one that has thrived in the shadows for years, even decades." Marcus leaned forward, his jaw set. "I get it, Dad," he replied, his voice tinged with emotion. "But I can't just sit back and watch. Not when this fight is about more than just me." For a moment, Mayor Parker's expression softened, and the man behind the public figure emerged, a father concerned for his son. "I know you want to act," he said gently, "but the best way to protect yourself and the mission is to stay out of the spotlight. We need to be precise, careful. This has to go smoothly." Marcus nodded reluctantly. He understood the logic, but the fire in his chest burned too brightly to ignore. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about creating real, lasting change. And he couldn't back down now, not when so much was at stake. The final plan was set into motion. As the day of reckoning approached, Marcus felt the familiar stir of nerves deep in his chest. The thought of facing the powerful and dangerous people behind the threats was terrifying. But this time, he wouldn't run. The stakes were too high. The city and the world was watching. Whatever came next, Marcus knew one thing for sure. This was his chance to make a difference, to change it all.